The courtroom was packed, yet silence hung heavy in the air as James Caldwell entered. He moved slowly, pushing the wheels of his chair with steady hands. His eyes, worn by time but filled with determination, revealed a man who had faced far worse battles. Now, his enemy was different, a corrupt system and a judge who had already chosen a side. From the bench, Judge Henry Whittaker adjusted his robe and cast a disdainful glance at James. With a sigh of boredom, he struck his gavel against the wood. "So, an old cripple like you thinks he can win in this court?" A murmur of shock rippled through the room, but no one dared to challenge the judge. James didn't flinch. He had heard worse before. When he returned from war, society treated him like a burden. Now, he was here to fight again, not on the battlefield, but for justice. His case was clear. He was suing Titan Construction for illegally demolishing his home, the only place he had left. The company claimed he had never owned the land. A blatant lie. James knew the truth, but proving it would be another battle. Beside him, Daniel Brooks, a young and inexperienced lawyer, shuffled through his papers nervously. Going against a billion-dollar company in Whittaker's courtroom was like stepping into a fight with both hands tied. But James showed no fear. He had survived much worse. He straightened in his wheelchair and locked eyes with the judge. His voice was steady, unwavering. "I don't think I can win, Your Honor." "I know I can." Whittaker's gaze darkened. He hadn't expected resistance. Titan Construction thought this case would be dismissed quickly. They were wrong. The real fight had only just begun. James Caldwell fears no battle, even against a corrupt system. But can he get justice? The court is against him, yet his determination never wavers. Want to see how this fight unfolds? Don't forget to subscribe. Hit the like button to support this gripping story. The battle has just begun. Don't miss the next chapter. A tense silence filled the courtroom. James Caldwell's words had struck a nerve. The smug expression on Judge Henry Whittaker's face faltered for just a moment before he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. He tapped his fingers against the polished wood, his eyes narrowing as he studied James like a predator sizing up its prey. "Confidence won't change the law, Mr. Caldwell. And in my courtroom, the law is crystal clear." His tone was condescending, laced with the arrogance of a man who had spent decades bending the legal system to his will. James, however, didn't even blink. He had faced men like Whittaker before, officers who abused their ranks, politicians who made empty promises, and now a judge who saw himself as untouchable. But James had learned long ago that even the most powerful men could fall. Across the room, Gregory Langston, Titan Construction's lead attorney, adjusted his expensive silk tie and smirked. He had seen this scenario play out countless times. An underdog, filled with righteous anger, thinking they stood a chance against a corporate giant. But the law wasn't about truth. It was about who had the best lawyers, the most money, and the right connections. And Titan Construction had all three. Seated beside James, Daniel Brooks, his young and inexperienced attorney, hesitated before standing. He cleared his throat, gripping his notes tightly, trying to steady his trembling hands. "Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. My client's home was unlawfully demolished. We have over 30 years of documentation proving his ownership." Judge Whittaker raised a hand sharply, silencing him mid-sentence. The smugness in his expression had returned. "Let's not waste time, Mr. Brooks. If your client truly owned the property, then why does Titan Construction have official documentation proving otherwise?" A murmur spread through the courtroom. James' grip tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. He had all the necessary paperwork, tax records, deeds, even utility bills in his name. So how the hell did Titan Construction have proof that he had never legally owned the land? Something wasn't right. Langston stood, his voice smooth and dripping with confidence. "Your Honor, We have legally verified records indicating that Mr. Caldwell was merely residing on the property, not its rightful owner. We understand that he may have believed otherwise, but the legal documents do not support his claim." James turned to Daniel, his jaw tightening. They were lying. They had somehow altered the records, erased his name, rewritten history to suit their needs. And with a judge like Whitaker overseeing the case, they were confident they'd get away with it. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, clearly satisfied. "Well, Mr. Caldwell, it seems the burden of proof is on you. Do you have anything to refute Titan Construction's official records?" James exhaled slowly. They thought they had already won. They thought he would back down, that he would accept defeat like so many others had before him. But James Caldwell had fought impossible battles before. And he wasn't about to lose this one. James Caldwell sat still, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. They had fabricated records. It was the only explanation. He had owned that house for more than 3 decades, paid his taxes, received his mail, and yet, somehow, Titan Construction had produced official-looking documents claiming otherwise. This wasn't just negligence. This was a deliberate act. Judge Whitaker watched him closely, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the bench. He was waiting for James to break, to get angry, to lose his composure. But James had spent a lifetime surviving impossible situations. He had been trained to endure, to outthink his enemy. This courtroom was just another battlefield. Daniel Brooks, shifting uncomfortably beside him, whispered, "James, their documents don't match what we have. But if Whitaker refuses to acknowledge our proof, we're going to need more than just paperwork. We need something they can't manipulate." James exhaled slowly. Titan Construction had money, influence, and now, it seemed, a judge in their pocket. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on. James Caldwell had fought for his country, and he understood the power of strategy. If the official records had been altered, then he needed to find proof that was beyond their reach. Langston, still standing with that smug smirk, glanced at the judge and shrugged. "Your Honor, with no legitimate proof of ownership from the plaintiff, I believe this case is already on shaky ground. If Mr. Caldwell has no further evidence, I move to dismiss." Judge Whitaker nodded slowly, pretending to consider it. James could see the trap being set right in front of him. If the case was dismissed now, he'd never have another chance to fight. But he wasn't done fighting. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I request a continuance. If Titan Construction's documents are truly legitimate, then they should hold up under deeper scrutiny. I have evidence stored outside of this courtroom that I need time to retrieve." Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't like this. He had expected James to fold under pressure. "A continuance? And what exactly do you intend to present?" James met the judge's gaze, unwavering. Historical records, witness testimony, and documents that haven't been conveniently misplaced or rewritten. A few gasps spread through the courtroom. Langston's smirk wavered, just slightly. He hadn't expected pushback. Judge Whitaker shifted in his seat, annoyed. After a long pause, he sighed and waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. You have 72 hours, Mr. Caldwell. But if you don't return with irrefutable evidence, this case is over." James simply nodded. 72 hours. It wasn't much time, but it was all he needed. Because what Whitaker and Langston didn't know was that James had already planned his next move. The gavel's echo faded, but the tension in the courtroom remained. James Caldwell had just 72 hours to prove that he legally owned a home he had lived in for over 3 decades. The irony wasn't lost on him. His proof should have been unquestionable, yet here he was, forced to fight for something that had already been his. As the crowd shuffled out of the courtroom, James remained still, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. Judge Whitaker's expression had made one thing clear: This wasn't just about the law. This was about power. Titan Construction wasn't just trying to take his house. They were trying to erase him, rewrite history as if he had never existed. But if there was one thing James Caldwell refused to be, it was forgotten. Daniel Brooks, his young lawyer, kept pace beside him as they exited the courthouse. His brow was furrowed, eyes dotting over his notes. He was nervous, and James didn't blame him. "James, we need more than just the deed. If Titan Construction has managed to alter the official records, they've probably covered every obvious angle. We need something they didn't think to erase." James nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. Corporate fraud was one thing, erasing a man's existence was another. They had tampered with legal documents, but they couldn't have wiped out everything. There had to be a gap in their cover-up, something they overlooked. And he was going to find it. "We're not looking for records, Daniel," James said, wheeling toward the parking lot. "We're looking for history." Their first stop was the county archives. Not the online database. James knew better than to trust digital records when dealing with corporate corruption. He needed something physical, something old enough that it couldn't have been quietly altered. The dimly lit records office smelled of dust and aging paper. Rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls, but James was focused on something even older: microfilm. Decades of land deeds, tax records, and property transfers had been stored here long before computers became the norm. Daniel scanned the labels, pulling reels from the shelves while James sifted through faded papers. Hours passed. Everything they found had already been altered or removed. It was as if his house had never existed. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. They covered their tracks too well. "This case is dead if we don't." James cut him off with a raised hand. His eyes were locked onto something buried beneath a stack of old property assessments, a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1987. The headline read, "Veteran builds home on family land after years of service." And below it, a photo of James, standing in front of his house, hammer in hand, smiling. A printed, published record. One that Titan Construction couldn't erase. Daniel grabbed the paper, his eyes widening. "This is it. A newspaper can't be altered like a legal document. We have proof that you lived there. Public proof." James exhaled slowly, nodding. It was a start. But a single article wasn't enough to win this fight. "Now," he said, voice steady, "we need a witness." And he knew exactly where to look. The newspaper clipping was a breakthrough, but it wasn't enough. Judge Whitaker wouldn't be swayed by an old article alone. They needed someone who could testify. Someone who remembered James living in that house, who could confirm his ownership before Titan Construction started erasing him from history. James stared at the faded photo of himself in the article. 36 years ago, he had built that house with his own hands. He remembered every brick, every nail, every drop of sweat that went into making it a home. There had to be someone who remembered too, someone whose memory couldn't be rewritten. Daniel Brooks tapped his fingers against the dashboard as he drove. Any neighbors from back then? Friends? Family? James' jaw tightened. No family left. The war had taken some, time had taken the rest. His closest friends had either moved or passed away. But then, a name surfaced in his mind. Walter Briggs. Daniel glanced at him. "Who's that?" James exhaled. "My old neighbor. Lived 2 houses down for decades. Think he'd testify?" James looked out the window. He hoped so. But the last time he had seen Walter was years ago. And a lot could change in that time. The sun was beginning to set when they pulled up to a small, worn-down house on the outskirts of town. Paint peeled from the walls, and the porch sagged under years of neglect. James' stomach tightened. Walter had always been meticulous about keeping his home in order. This wasn't a good sign. Daniel knocked on the door. Silence. Then, after a long pause, the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing a frail man with sunken eyes and shaking hands. Walter had aged far beyond his years. Illness had taken its toll. His tired eyes landed on James, and for a moment there was no recognition. Then, something shifted. "James." His voice was raspy, weak. James nodded. "It's been a while, Walter." Walter's gaze drifted to the wheelchair. Something in his expression changed. "I heard about the accident." He swallowed hard. "They took your house, didn't they?" James felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Yeah. And I need your help to get it back." Walter's grip tightened on the doorframe. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "You should come inside." And with that, James knew he had just found the key to his case. What would you do if everything you built was taken from you? Would you fight to get it back? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Walter Briggs led James and Daniel into his dimly lit living room, where the air was thick with dust and time. Faded curtains barely filtered the dying sunlight, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. James noticed the trembling in Walter's hands, the deep lines on his face. Whatever had happened to him over the years, it had left its mark. Walter settled into an old recliner, exhaling heavily. He looked at James for a long moment before speaking. "I knew something wasn't right the moment I saw the bulldozers roll in." His voice was raspy, but steady. "They didn't come with notice. No warning. Just tore it down like you had never been there." James' fists clenched. That was exactly what Titan Construction wanted, to erase his existence. Daniel leaned forward, pen in hand. "Walter, do you remember James living there? Can you testify to that in court?" Walter's lips pressed into a thin line. A hesitation. James saw it, and a familiar, uneasy feeling settled in his gut. "I can testify," Walter said slowly, his eyes flickering toward the window. "But it won't be enough." James frowned. "What do you mean?" Walter's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his fingers tapping anxiously. "They didn't just erase your name from the records, James. They threatened anyone who could prove you lived there." A cold silence settled over the room. "Threatened?" Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Walter nodded. "After they took your house, a man came to my door. A lawyer from Titan Construction. He told me to forget you ever lived there. That if I testified, there'd be consequences." James exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on his chair. Titan Construction had covered all their tracks, including silencing the people who could expose them. "Walter, I know you're scared," James said, his voice steady. "But if we back down, they win. And they'll do it to someone else. We have to fight this." Walter's eyes met James. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I kept something." His voice was barely audible. "Something they didn't know about." James felt his pulse quicken. "What?" Walter struggled to his feet and disappeared into the back of the house. Moments later, he returned with a small, battered shoebox. He placed it on the coffee table, his hands shaking as he removed the lid. Inside, old photographs, letters, and a stack of documents. And at the very top, a copy of James' original deed, signed, notarized, and irrefutable. Daniel let out a breathless laugh. "James, this is it. This is what we need." James looked at Walter, his voice filled with gratitude. "You just gave me my home back." But Walter shook his head, his expression darkening. "Not yet. Titan Construction won't go down without a fight. And if they know what you have now..." He swallowed. They'll come after you. James leaned back, gripping the edges of his chair. The war wasn't over. But now at least he had a weapon. And he was ready to use it. The weight of the shoebox sat heavy in James' lap. Inside it was more than just paper. It was his past, his proof, his last chance to win. The deed, photographs, and letters were undeniable evidence that he had owned the property long before Titan Construction claimed otherwise. But as he stared at the documents, he knew this wasn't over. Walter sat across from him, his frail hands gripping the armrests of his recliner. His eyes were clouded with something James recognized instantly: fear. "Walter, if you had this all along, why didn't you come forward?" James asked, though he already suspected the answer. Walter hesitated, then exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I know what these people are capable of." Daniel Brooks, who had been flipping through the documents with growing excitement, paused, looking up. "What do you mean?" Walter's fingers tapped anxiously against the chair. "I told you they threatened me. But it wasn't just words, James." His voice cracked. "I had a wife." The room went still. James felt his breath catch. "Had." Walter swallowed hard. "Martha. She was strong, stubborn, just like you. When I told her about Titan Construction's threats, she wanted to fight back. She started digging, looking for proof, trying to expose what they were doing." His voice trembled. 2 weeks later, she was in a car accident. They ruled it as mechanical failure, but I know the truth. James' grip tightened on the edge of his wheelchair. Titan Construction had silenced her. Daniel looked pale. "Walter, are you saying—" "I'm saying that these people don't just erase documents, they erase people." Walter's voice was flat, emotionless. "That's why I stayed quiet. That's why I didn't come forward. And that's why you need to be careful." A heavy silence settled between them. James had fought wars before, but this was different. This was a battle fought in the shadows, where the enemy never showed their face until it was too late. Then, as if on cue, there was a loud knock at the door. Walter's entire body went rigid. James felt his heartbeat pick up. Daniel exchanged a nervous glance with him before stepping toward the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. Black SUV. Tinted windows. Just sitting there. Daniel's voice was tight. "They know we're here." Walter's hands shook as he reached for the shoebox and shoved it toward James. "Take it. Go. Now." James hesitated. Running had never been his style. But this wasn't about pride. This was about survival. If they stayed, Titan Construction would make sure they never left. Daniel grabbed the box, stuffing the papers into his bag. "James, we need to move." Another knock. Harder this time. James clenched his jaw. This war had just become personal. And now, he was ready to finish it. The second knock was louder, more forceful. Whoever was outside wasn't just waiting, they were demanding. James Caldwell had faced danger before, but this felt different. This wasn't the battlefield, where he had a weapon in his hands and soldiers at his side. This was a war fought in the dark, with enemies who wore suits instead of uniforms. Daniel Brooks backed away from the window, his face pale. "They're not leaving, James." Walter Briggs struggled to his feet, his breath shaky. "There's a back door. Take it. Now." James hesitated, gripping the arms of his wheelchair. Running wasn't in his nature. But this wasn't just about him anymore. Walter had risked everything to give him proof, and Daniel was in danger just for helping him. Staying would be suicide. The third knock came, not a knock anymore, but a fist pounding against the wood. "Mr. Briggs, open the door." A voice. Low, cold, controlled. James exchanged a look with Daniel. This wasn't the police. Walter was already moving, pulling open a side door that led to a narrow hallway. "Go," he hissed. Daniel slung the bag over his shoulder, gripping James' wheelchair as he pushed him toward the back of the house. Every second felt like an eternity. James could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. Then, just as they reached the back door, the front door exploded inward. Walter let out a strangled gasp. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden floor. Men in dark suits flooded the house, moving with military precision. James gritted his teeth. Titan Construction wasn't just playing dirty, they were playing like criminals. Daniel yanked open the back door, shoving James through first. The cool night air hit them like a slap. The backyard was overgrown, leading into a dark alleyway. "Move, move," Daniel hissed, pushing James forward. Behind them, voices shouted. They had seconds before the men realized they were gone. James gritted his teeth, gripping the wheels of his chair. His body ached from the urgency, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had fought too hard to lose now. As they reached the alley, Daniel gasped. "Shit!" Another black SUV. Engine running. Waiting. James' heart pounded. They were boxed in. But then, tires screeched in the distance. A rusted blue pickup truck barreled down the alley, headlights flashing. "Walter! Get in!" Walter shouted from the driver's seat. Daniel didn't hesitate. He yanked open the passenger door, hoisted James inside, and threw himself in after. The second the door slammed shut, Walter hit the gas. The SUV behind them lunged forward, giving chase. Titan Construction wasn't letting them go that easily. James braced himself against the dashboard. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about survival. The rusted blue pickup sped down the alley, its tires spitting gravel as Walter Briggs gripped the wheel with shaking hands. The black SUV followed close behind, its engine roaring like a predator on the hunt. James Caldwell felt the weight of the shoebox in his lap, the evidence Titan Construction wanted to destroy. Every piece of paper inside was proof that they had lied, forged documents, and erased his existence. And now, they were willing to kill to keep it buried. Daniel Brooks twisted in his seat, looking out the rear window. His voice was tight with fear. "They're right on us. Walter, can this thing go any faster?" Walter clenched his jaw. "You want speed? Hold on." He jerked the wheel to the left, barely squeezing the truck through a narrow gap between two buildings. The SUV tried to follow, too wide. It clipped the brick wall with a sickening crunch, slowing down just enough to give them a lead. James exhaled sharply. A small victory, but they weren't safe yet. Walter pushed the truck onto a main road, weaving between traffic. They were heading straight for downtown. Daniel looked at James. "Where do we go? We can't outrun them forever." James' mind worked fast. Running wouldn't end this. Titan Construction would keep coming until they buried him for good. The only way to stop them was to make sure the world saw what they had done. "We're going to the courthouse." Walter's eyes widened. "You insane? That's the first place they'll look." "Exactly." James' voice was steel. "But they won't try anything in front of the press, the public, and a judge. They don't need to kill me if they can discredit me. So we don't hide, we expose them." Daniel's hands trembled around the bag of documents. "You think Whitaker will let this see the light of day?" James' lips curled into something almost resembling a smile. "We're not giving him a choice." The courthouse loomed ahead, glowing under the city lights. The street was busy with reporters, lawyers, and staff leaving for the night. The perfect audience. Walter slammed on the brakes, stopping right at the courthouse steps. James grabbed the bag from Daniel and flung the truck door open. "Get inside. Now." Daniel scrambled out, pulling James' wheelchair down, his hands fumbling in urgency. Walter, breathless, glanced over his shoulder. "They're here." James didn't need to turn. He could feel them. The black SUV skidded to a stop across the street. Doors opened. Men in suits stepped out, but they didn't charge. Not here. Not in front of the crowd. James pushed forward, his wheelchair rolling toward the courthouse entrance. Reporters turned, cameras flashing. One of the suited men pulled out a phone, speaking into it. Then, the SUV doors slammed shut. James watched as the car pulled away. They weren't done. But neither was he. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, Titan Construction would finally face someone they couldn't erase. And James Caldwell would make sure the world was watching. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. Word had spread fast. A disabled war veteran taking on $1 billion corporation, accusing them of fraud, corruption, and attempted cover-up. Cameras flashed as James Caldwell rolled through the doors, his face calm, but his eyes burning with purpose. Daniel Brooks walked beside him, clutching the bag filled with evidence. Every paper inside was a weapon. The deed, the newspaper article, Walter's testimony. Titan Construction had spent years burying the truth. But today, James would dig it back up. Inside the courtroom, Judge Henry Whitaker sat high on his bench, looking as composed as ever. But James saw it, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against the wood. Whitaker knew this case had spiraled beyond his control. Across the room, Gregory Langston adjusted his expensive suit, his expression unreadable. But James knew what he was thinking. Titan Construction had lost its chance to silence him, and now their only option was to win by legal force. But they wouldn't. Not today. The hearing began. Langston spoke first, his voice smooth, confident. "Your Honor, this case has been built on misplaced emotions rather than facts. Mr. Caldwell has no valid legal claim to the property in question. Titan Construction followed proper procedures." "Objection." Daniel's voice rang through the courtroom, stronger than it had ever been. He wasn't nervous anymore. Judge Whitaker sighed. "On what grounds, Mr. Brooks?" Daniel pulled the newspaper clipping from his bag and held it high. "This, Your Honor, is a publicly published article from 1987, featuring my client standing in front of his home. A home Titan Construction claims he never owned." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Whitaker's face darkened. Langston's confidence faltered. But Daniel wasn't done. He pulled out Walter Briggs' sworn affidavit, signed just hours before. And this is a statement from a direct witness, Mr. Walter Briggs, who lived next to Mr. Caldwell for over 30 years. His testimony confirms that my client legally owned and resided in that home, until Titan Construction had it unlawfully destroyed. Langston stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is circumstantial." James spoke for the first time. "Then why did Titan Construction send armed men after me last night?" A collective gasp filled the room. Whitaker's hand clenched around his gavel. Langston looked like he had swallowed glass. James turned his gaze toward the judge. "You wanted proof, Your Honor? Here it is. Now tell me, are you going to let them bury it again?" Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then, Whitaker exhaled sharply and leaned forward. "Mr. Caldwell's claim is upheld. His property was unlawfully seized. Titan Construction will face full legal proceedings." Bang. The gavel struck. James Caldwell had won. Langston paled. The press erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled. James didn't move. He just breathed. For the first time in years, he felt something real, vindication. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, James." James Caldwell looked past the chaos, past the cameras, past the suits who thought they could erase him. "No," he said quietly. "We did." And with that, he rolled out of the courthouse, no longer a man fighting for survival, but a man who had won. If you enjoyed this story and want more thrilling narratives like this, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring even more powerful and gripping stories to you. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were in James Caldwell's place? Do you think Titan Construction might try something again? I want to hear your thoughts. See you in the next one.